I'm David Savarese. I'm an urban planner and environmental manager. I work at a large engineering firm, and Maggie is a recent graduate of the SEAS program at the University of Michigan. For those of you that have been attending our calls over the last few months, um, you'll know that CBPR has come up over and over again. Um, Community-based participatory research is a way in which health systems and academic institutions engage with the public, typically through a robust process, including informed consent. And I think it's a strong foundation for us to build our engagement processes for for community and adaptation. Before I start a meeting or a call, I usually like to talk about something called a culture of caring moment, which is where we take a breath and talk about something that is not really related to the subject, but maybe is something worth spending a minute on sharing about. And for me, that is that disability touches us all. More than 1 in 6 Americans has some role as a carer or a caregiver, and that's pretty robust, and it's something that really is a cornerstone of many of our family lives. And it's a major reason for my wanting to be involved in this program here today, where we think about vulnerability and home and community. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to make sure that folks that are in the most challenging of circumstances have the tools at their disposal to protect themselves and to protect their family. I hope that this moment resonates with you and it brings something to light that most people don't talk about, which is that we all have challenges in our own homes that we need to focus on first and foremost. So I really respect and appreciate everyone coming to this call today, because I know there's a lot of conflicts out there, both personally and professionally, and I appreciate you taking the time to consider how we engage community as a whole. Oh, always forget. I'm sorry I missed the very beginning. Maybe Sylvia mentioned this already. This is going to be part of a 3-meeting series. Today, we're going to be introducing kind of the statement of opportunity for how we can learn about community-based participatory research, incorporate it into adaptation planning and our work as a group, and to think about some of the problems that we could potentially overcome by utilizing tools like CBPR or community action research or other kind of ways in which to bring the community back into the process. The next meeting is going to be more of a panel where we're going to bring some experts to the table to share their experiences in terms of how to engage community and to learn from some of the challenges that we might be able to identify today through our dialogue and through our Mentimeter share. And then meeting 3 is when we're going to coalesce on solutions. Although Maggie and I talked about, and the team as a whole, the leadership team as a whole, talked about potential solutions to being able to better incorporate community into the planning and adaptation process. We really want to state the problem as a group here today, investigate it on the second meeting with some expertise, and then come together to the third meeting to say, these are some actions that we can take and incorporate into not only our group's activities, the adaptation and vulnerability group's activities, but also kind of our personal and professional experiences as well. I know that's a large chunk of time to devote to the question of how do we better engage community, but I think this will be valuable to our leadership team to better understand our goals and priorities as a group. I work for a large company, and more than ever, we're starting to consider questions like, how do we create value for human beings? How do we think at the scale of a person? How do we shape change when we work on large infrastructure projects? And it all ties back to a lot of activities that are currently happening in our society, both in terms of how federal spending is being dedicated, but also how practice and best practice is being incorporated into the scopes of work that we are beholden to as a consulting company. So in an attempt to be proactive, Jacobs and many other companies like mine are really reconsidering the planning process, the community engagement process, what inclusivity means to program and project delivery. There's a lot of responsibility for the private sector. I encourage you all to join the private sector calls to see what we're talking about there. It's another member-led interest group. But by and large, I think the number one message of this slide is that commitments are being made. And it's an opportunity for folks like us to make sure that those commitments are being followed through, right? It's great to set ESG goals, but if we just let them go to the wayside, we're not going to see any progress in the very tactical and strategic parts of our process, like engaging the community during planning. Sorry for the pitch. What is community-based CB? Community-based participatory research. I'll share this slide deck after the call. We also have some pre-reading for the next two meetings that we'd like folks to kind of know what exists, to better inform the dialogue with our experts and better inform the solutioning that we're creating in our third meeting. But at a very high level, community-based participatory research is based on a foundation of these bullets here. And they're not the only bullets, and we'll discuss them in a second. But it's the idea of seeing community as unities of identity, right? And the best way to describe that is that community is not a tree. It doesn't start with the main trunk and grow into leaves. It's better described as a fence where everything ties together and is incorporated and interconnected. And that's what provides it the strength and the adaptive capacity that allows us to react to those most problematic, those wicked problems. Society is mutually reinforcing, and together, in the most challenging circumstances, when we come together, we develop our strengths and our ability to respond and react. So the idea of there being many identities coming together, all together at once in this kind of coalition, is an important thing to remember. And we'll get at that. The multiplicity of identity and community is something that's a very big challenge that we'll talk about during this presentation today. And then you're going to see some bullets here that are very kind of obvious, which is to build on the existing strengths of the communities and the NGOs within them, and the academic institutions that serve them, and the other institutions and government institutions that work on a daily basis, boots on the ground in the weeds, to build on the strengths and the capacities of community. More and more, we see this need to facilitate equitable and collaborative partnerships. It's easy to say, it's hard to do. Building equity and collaboration means that you have to make eye contacts with your community and your constituencies, and work through the hard and difficult processes to create an action orientation, to create consensus, and then to build against that consensus. Co-learning and capacity building are fundamental. Ultimately, not everyone is an expert, and we need to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to participate equally and for their opinions and ideas to not only be shared and recognized, but incorporated into the action planning. As a consequence of that, while we're building capacity and learning, it's critical to not only generate that knowledge, but to share it and document it so that we're able to create co-benefit in the future. Like I was saying, if we're all interconnected, that means all of our projects work to, in some way, shape, or form, impact the overall goal. Knowledge generation and intervention for co-benefit is something that's really important, but it's also important to have focus and to think about the process and the timelines and the cycles. So you're not going to do everything overnight. Sometimes it feels like you need to do everything overnight, but it's important to focus on that generation of knowledge and to think about long-term results and to work incrementally and iteratively, building those partnerships, building the community, and then resulting in positive impact Or if it doesn't result in positive impact, course correcting and getting to a point where you're meeting your goals and your challenges together. Lots more on this. I strongly encourage you to take a look at some of the pre-reading material we'll share at the end. I see some items in the chat. I don't see any questions, so we'll kind of move on. I think this is the first interactive slide. Oh, no, it's not. How is community-based participatory research different? It's a shift from it's incorporating people into the process instead of the recipient of the process. So shifting from outsiders to being part of the process, shifting from professionals to educators and sharers, to shift from the project is over, we're leaving, to an ongoing incremental process that builds strength within the community so that everything they work on together is a culmination that has a positive benefit in the end. So it's really shifting from this, outsider point of view into a change agent and a collaborator role. And in order to do that, especially in the health sector, where there's a very stringent and rigorous requirements on things like informed consent, for us to bring a conceptual model to the table that acknowledges the many contexts in which we operate and how complicated all the different partnership structures and all the stakeholders and actors that are already in our communities can come together, design an intervention, see how it makes an impact, and scale and repeat and modify the projects where they're seeing successes, tweaking out the circumstances that create non-positive impacts. So as you'll see, this is a very complicated model. It's also one of the most utilized models, right? So how can we take the work that's being done in the health sector and incorporate that into the community planning and development work that many of us focus on? Okay. Here we go. For those of you, let me know if I need to bring the QR code back up. Happy to do that. I can also, while you're thinking about whether community-based participatory research or community engagement resonates with you or not, if somebody could type something in, just so I know it's working, that would be fantastic. And then I'll go back to the QR code I know we had a late joiner. Thank you. So please forgive me. And think about this question. How does community-based research and community participation resonate with you, or does it not at all? And for those of you, and you can always just go to menti.com and type in this 8 number. Oh, look at that. Science. You just click on that. So I can't see who's saying what. Sorry for that. But let me riff on some of the things that we're seeing here. Community-based art and liminal spaces. I'm actually a participant in the Guerrilla Science Climate Action Working Group, where bringing people into the process through art and science and music and learning, physical and tangible and liminal experiences are something that people take away, right? Going to a community meeting where you get a handout, the meeting ends, and then you go away is not a community-based exercise. CBPR does resonate, and especially when you're working with the most vulnerable and overlooked peoples, right? And in a minute, I'm going to go through some best practices and identifying the whole of community through your engagement process is a critical first step. The desirable system state is super important. To be able to articulate your goalposts and to be able to think about what it's going to take to get everyone across that finish line is, I know I'm blending metaphors here, is super awesome because there's not unlimited time, there's not unlimited budget. How can we make the most of the resources that are available to achieve our goals is something we're going to, I think, continue to talk about over the course of this series. And if anybody wants to chime in on their comments, I know I'm really pleased to see that there's a lot of people participating here today. I think we can even scroll down. Yeah. Emphasizing listening is probably a good thing for me to do right now. Anybody have anything to chime in on community-based research or community participation? Hearing none, but really appreciating everyone giving the written feedback. I'm gonna move forward to the next slide. Ingrid, did you have I saw you jump on the camera. Did you have something you wanted to add?
I guess for the sake of conversations, in a way, our world isn't structured for it. We're over-programmed, and so the taking time to spend time with neighbors sometimes feels like an extra, which is a shame.
Yeah, especially after COVID, right? Where we got used to hybrid meetings, we got used to Mentimeter, right? And that fills a lot of gaps, but we can't go away from making eye contact, from touching elbows with the people that we're going to be working with together. So I think the hybrid approach is something we're going to be talking about in the future. And thinking about how we're able to use like asynchronous online tools at the same time for kind of bringing people together is something worth investigating. Also, thanks again for these answers. We're going to be saving the recording, and we will type up kind of a takeaway from this meeting to empower the series going forward. Thank you, Ingrid, for your thoughtful feedback and commentary. And I think it's something we're going to be chasing down. And the next slide, I think we'll talk a little bit more about other relevant methods. Although we're talking about community-based participatory research today, I have been using community action and public engagement interchangeably, right? I do think that CBPR is a great, robust methodology for making sure that all the voices are heard and that people are actively included in the process. But let's not remember that there's a long menu of processes available to communities and governments when considering adaptation planning or disaster risk reduction. Community-based participatory research largely stems out of participatory action research, which was this idea that you had the academy, that you had government, and you had NGOs all working towards the same ends, and that you have action research being this exercise between the community and the academy, and you have participatory research as engaging like the academy and government together. All of these things come together in a process. I call these the cousins to CBPR, but in many ways, they're the children of participatory action research, where we're considering new ways to bring this Venn diagram into one single circle, where we're working together in this constructive and systematic way. Community action planning is probably the best known of these child or cousin methodologies. And that's a very traditional process of stepwise stage gates of what are we working on? How are we going to meet that? Do we achieve the goals that we intended to at the start? And if not, what more can we do? Or do we take on a new topic? Critical to think about community action planning, because once you build the momentum of the community, you don't want to just stop after you solve a problem. You want to identify the next one. right? And solve it together with all of the work you've done to date. Whether that's creating a charity or building a 501c3, you want it to be iterative and to go on, unless it's not your mission. And then finally, one of the planning exercises that adaptation professionals might be a little bit more aware of is the incident action planning model, which is how do the emergency managers and the city planners and the fire chiefs get together with community after something or before something occurs, and then when that incident occurs, how do they quickly adapt to be able to solve the problems that were identified proactively. Being able to do that proactive intervention really helps for efficiency, and the more efficiency you're able to identify after a disaster or an incident happens, the better it is for vulnerable populations. And then in the design world, I'm an urban planner, so I'm going to throw this one in there real quick. There's also this idea of universal design, it's a good one to kind of throw out as an in the weeds model, because it says this is exactly what you want to do if you want to build a place for everybody. And I think it's worth thinking about not only like, how do you reconsider place? How do you reconsider access and equity and usability for everyone? And it's a really fundamental model, I think, that helps us understand what is it going to take in order for us to create places where the community can engage together proactively towards an aspirational goal. And more, it's important, as our mandates are not just, cut the ribbon on that metro station. It's cut the ribbon on the elevator that gives everyone equal access to that metro station. And then finally, there's also, oh no, I have sorry, next slide. But here's another opportunity for us to share some of our thoughts and to create a dialogue that will shape the next two sessions, which is, how do you all, whether you engage your communities or you engage your constituencies as a government, or you just engage stakeholders and clients, what do you do to make sure you're creating an authentic, useful connection with others? I love that one that someone just put up there, which is to find the genuine similarities and common goals. And that's where, I created, or I shared a very kind of robust, complicated methodology at the beginning of this exercise, right? And it's good, and it's something that can guide our thinking and guide the process and guide the development of materials that we share and create. But the idea of just getting into a room and having everybody write their ideas down on some postcards or a whiteboard to find out where that consensus already exists is a genius level approach, instead of coming at it backwards where the tail wags the dog, where we bring everybody in together and try to drive them towards some consensus. Finding that consensus to start is really a great opportunity to avoid the pitfalls of creating something for somebody as opposed to with somebody. Which co-creation, I love the term co-creation, and I think that there's a real opportunity to put your hands in the dirt, right? To say, like, what is it that we're all working on and how can we do it together? And then through the school system is another one. And everyone, please remember your comments here, because there's plenty of opportunity to chit chat about them later in the presentation, because these are all great ideas. The school system for example, is something in the planning community is that we've been really talking about, which is that it's never too early to engage students in the planning process. And there are currently activities ongoing in the APA where they're thinking about how do you get elementary school children involved in the process of thinking about and developing community. And I think there might be a solution baked in there. Like, what do we do? Adaptation planning. How do we bring it into the elementary schools without it being kind of an inappropriate, like the sky is falling type scenario for young children, is something that I think will be very valuable to our community going in the future. Great. Yeah. And I think that we're seeing in this response here, we're seeing a lot of bring people together and listen, right? Convene a group. And one thing I'll throw out there, a bit of a hot take, is sometimes it is a small group of people that makes a difference, right? Just because you only have 4 people show up to a meeting doesn't mean that you can't achieve a transformational change, right? Sometimes it's even easier, right? But it's still important, even if you have a small collective, it's even more important to reach out to a broader group of people to make sure that your consensus is reflective of the community as a whole. Thank you for your feedback, everyone. Any comments or questions before I move on to the next? Again, plenty of time to chime in later in the presentation. Groundwork USA, I really love their work. I strongly advise folks take a look at their organization and their website. They have this is a 4-pager. I paraphrased and made some modifications of my own herein, but here are some of the best practices that I found to be part of engagement. And I think it's great that they're reflective of what you all were commenting in the previous slide. Number 1, identify the underrepresented, right? If you only have 4 people in the room, who's not there, right? Step number 1, who's not here and how do we bring them to the table? Number 2, I almost changed this to say sympathize and empathize. And I still believe in empathy very much, even more so than kind of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. But I do think that's a good turn of phrase. In particular, in the city planning world, something that I encourage my junior staff to do is to bring a stroller out into the community when they are thinking about creating accessible spaces, right? Not only like imagine yourself in someone else's shoes, but to actually put yourself in their shoes, right? If you're talking about a community, go to that community. Don't just go to the community, walk it, bike it, drive it, sit down and have a cup of coffee, talk to the barista. These are things that actually will inform the way that you think and collaborate. Active listening. Active listening is something I'm not doing a very good job right now of, but it's to listen, to ask questions, to examine the answers to those questions, and then to react and respond. So the idea of being able to capture the feedback like we're capturing in these slides here today, and then ask more questions about it, is a critical process towards incrementally improving towards a successful solution. Do the work, gather the input, right? Think about consensus, think about language and barriers, first and foremost. And in general, when you go through the process of creating a goal, creating a mission statement, aligning your tasks against that goal and mission, have those core principles. And ASAP is really great at core principles and suggesting the best way of being able to be inclusive in your activities to overcome these barriers, but without practicing those core principles, you're not going to achieve the ends that you're after, which is to make sure all your solutions are equally appropriate for all of the stakeholders in your community. Dedicate funding probably should have went first, frankly, right? Like, this is a long game. You're never going to rethink community and engage community participation participation in kind of one single project. There needs to be a long-term program led by government or led by advocates where there's money funding active resources instead of just relying on volunteerism. Rethink your locations. I mentioned liminal spaces earlier. I like public libraries. I think they're often cited appropriately, but there are oftentimes places that are more accessible than others. Think about where people live, think about where they go to, and try to find a space where they feel comfortable and open to dialogue. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking restaurants, right? Is there a restaurant in your community that people would want to go to or feel comfortable in, instead of just that kind of typical public space where you're reserving a conference room in the city hall? I saw there was an artist in the group. Get creative, right? Do things differently, get hands-on. But in order to be creative, in order to have a like very wide dialogue, a say anything type dialogue, you might want to consider Chatham House rules. You might want to consider some more kind of robust ways of setting the rules for engagement so that one voice can't dominate the others. It's a very difficult task. Tap existing resources. We discussed this earlier. And I put this one in here. Breaking bread is transformational, right? It might cost a little bit of money. It might take a lot of time, but the conversations that people have around the apples and cheddar are sometimes something you're never going to be able to find with a one-directional PowerPoint presentation. And then you're never gonna get 100% success, right? So there are some limitations. You're never going to get everybody to the table. But if there's something that you as a team have agreed to in your mission and goals, make sure you understand what those non-negotiables are and make sure you dedicate the resources that are necessary to do that correctly. Joyce Coffey, I think she's an active member of ASAP and UN Arise. I cropped these directly from her work, from Climate Risk Consulting. Great firm. They really understand what kind of the keys are to equity and justice during engagement. It's the 7 A's, according to Joyce. And sort of access and communication and accommodation and acknowledgement, attention and alignment are key. I would suggest that you make these the non-negotiables to start when you're thinking about doing thoughtful community engagement. I think this is the next one. So another opportunity to kind of, before I move on to this one, I'm curious if these 7 A's for equity and justice resonate with the team. Does anybody kind of have any comments or anything to add to activities that you should bring to the table when you're trying to achieve equity?
I'm not sure I understand what aspiring here means, and like, would you give some examples of what it means and what would look like when you are meeting people and engaging them?
Sure. Aspiring to be anti-racist. I'm going to throw Robert Moses under the bus, right? The idea that you can make a unilateral decision for the good of community as a whole is a long-standing tradition, right? That you're doing it on behalf of someone, but disproportionately, minority communities, poor communities, are the ones that face the brunt of the negative externalities, right? Where are you going to put the road through? Where are you going to put the new road through? Through the center of a poor community, right? And maybe it's the cheapest land, right? But it's not reflective of the need to be anti-racist, right? So acknowledging early, like, hey, we don't like, even if it costs more money, right? Even if we are upsetting an empowered interest group, right? Don't put that in my backyard, right? There's an active need to be able to consider what options are available that are not representative of the needs of minority communities that are often disproportionately affected. Curious if anyone has thoughts on whether or not minority communities are disproportionately affected by community-wide interventions. Right. And even in the future, maybe we could change it, instead of just aspiring to be anti-racist, committing to be anti-racist. Build it into your mission statement.
I just have maybe a question or something to add in, but how do you like aspire to be anti-racist or anti whatever the community is dealing with, while, for example, they have gone through that before, from people like an organization, let's say like yours, and still they have not yet been able to build trust to bring in other organizers or other people to like help them out, because the other people came in the name of helping also. So how do you like address that and be able to tell the community or prove to them that what your actions are, and just help them heal from what they went through? Could speak of like colonialism, yes, racist issues, and looking at, for example, Africa, where people come in the name of helping, and I'm not saying everyone, but some are just there for their own benefit, and the damage keeps on getting done, but no one is trying to remedy that damage, or at least not most are.
And I'll be honest, I don't have the answer. I have an anecdote for you though. My first project was with the Housing and Urban Development Hope 6 program, which was an exercise to change public housing in America, which was having deteriorating housing stock, isolation of community, no access to transit and jobs, right? And so the government came forward with a deliberate effort to say like, hey, this housing isn't working. We need to fix it, right? How do we do so? And I was working on a project in Bradenton, Florida, where the housing complex, whenever there was an inch of rain, because it was at the lowest topography in the community, even if there was just a tiny bit of rain, every house in the community would flood, right? So there was a chronic issue within this housing that the government needed to solve and committed funding to solve. I think it was a really great program, and I think there were lots of positives about it. If you Google it, there's lots of criticism of how it went down, right? And I would push back against that. But to add to the criticism, I'll throw out that I was in college when we were working on this project, and it was 5 years of dedicated funding to having people come into the community, and I call it on the knock on every doors process. So everyone that lived in the housing community was interviewed twice a year over the course of 5 years. During the first 2 years of the program, those interviews and communications were intended to relay, hey, we're about to tear everything down, move you to a new location, rebuild it, move you back in, right? Largely successful. During year 2, when we engaged the Spanish-speaking community, they had much less knowledge of what was going down, right? Like, what? You're tearing down my house, you're moving me out, and then you're moving me back in? So even though much diligence and effort was made towards writing the flyer in Spanish and putting it all over the place, right? And having meetings at various times throughout the day, that community was not as aware as the English-speaking community. So what's the solution to that? If we were to go back in time and try again, Bring the NGOs to the table? Yes. Have the NGOs involved, the representative bodies that speak for the community authentically, like that work for the community from the start? I think that's the answer we're going to find, right? So I think you've pointed to a very serious problem here. Like, what does it mean to be anti-racist? Why can't we just like empower local people instead of bringing outsiders in? I think that's something we need to explore in the next 2 sessions. Anybody else have kind of any ideas on these most challenging questions, which is like, how do we be anti-racist? And how do we not be racist in the future?
You spoke before me.
You go ahead, Solange.
Okay, no worries. I just want to say my experience has been it's easy to speak about that. It's so difficult to do, you know. It's very difficult to see that in action, you know. And I'm not saying that maybe, I guess some people are willing to do that, but there is also another complex system that I believe makes it hard to see that in action, or even to practice the courage to do that while we are planning and doing our projects, small scale or large scale. Yeah, because of different things, because of history, because how resources have been used in the past that still affect how, you know, the decisions that we need to make in the present and then in the future. But also there is something, you know, you spoke about earlier, community most of the times separated from stakeholders, which makes it difficult. It's like sometimes an option, you know, you speak to them or not. Probably, I don't know if you will have time to kind of read that as well. Yeah. I'm just learning from my experience doing research in Puerto Rico, and my research focuses on understanding community engagement in climate adaptation planning. And, you know, Puerto Rico context has been very interesting so far in terms of, you know, the climate change, disasters, and everything that is associated to that. And, you know, conducting interviews with different organizations, I've, you know, learned a lot in terms of, you know, wherever you can wish to be anti-racist, anti-poor, it just can't come overnight, you know. Some people have to take decisions that they are not even willing to do. They're like, okay, I wish we can do better, but we can't because there is something else. And the others have excuses of not doing so well because, because of other connected problems that can't be solved, maybe in a short amount of time. I don't know if you have other thoughts to share, but yeah, speaking from experience, that's what I see. Very easy to talk about that, very difficult to do.
Yeah, no, and I don't have thoughts to share. Well, I do have thoughts to share, but I think the most important thing to recognize now is we have the next 2 meetings to really chew on that problem. And I was coming at this meeting thinking like, maybe we need a new methodology, right? Maybe we need a new method. And what I'm hearing from y'all is like, maybe we need to transform the systems in which we operate before we even think about like a new method, right? And more importantly, people can, you know, the method that exists today is like, did you do community outreach? Yeah, I had 3 meetings. I did 150 interviews. The box is checked. And like, what, then what? Right? Like, okay, here's all this kind of qualitative learning that we developed during that process. And we use it to inform our scenarios, like to inform our decision making. But does it actually make any transformational change? Maybe not. So I'll put that in the back of my mind, which is robust transformational system change is something we might want to aspire to instead of just a new public engagement methodology.
one concept that from teaching in a rural school, then to an inner city school all in one day, I was thinking about adaptation. And so as I walk into this rural provider community, kind of really situating myself for meeting them where they're at, because I mentioned Indigenous perspectives on nature-based solutions in the last 5 minutes, and then was chastised, and I was told I could have lost the room in the last 5 minutes after providing them with, real things that they hadn't heard of before. And so adaptation, is a concept I've been wrestling.
Yeah, and finding the time and money to do it. Right. And I think we will be able to touch on things like, how do we create efficiencies? How do we build from a body of knowledge? How do we develop that trust that we were talking about earlier in advance? And more importantly, I personally think that ASAP is a wonderful forum to kind of suss that out. Right? Just the consequence of them selecting us as a group to work on this problem this year, right? And to spend 3 months of 10 people's time talking about, like, okay, what's the problem? What are some solutions? What are we going to do about it? I'm hoping ends up being a productive exercise. ... If any of you have any ideas on what we should be doing for the next 2 months, put it in this, or send me an email, or send any of us an email, and we'll incorporate it. That's why we haven't given a whole lot of thought to, like, what's happening in meeting 3, is because we really wanted to have meeting number 1 first. I'm not an expert in SEI or DEI. My coworker Hidejo is, and I created this presentation, and I went through the methodologies, and I talked about the workflows, and I had all the ideas, and her feedback was, stop, keep it simple, 3 steps, right? Identify the disadvantaged communities that are underrepresented, right? Increase your understanding of their needs, and then work towards those needs. Right. And that's potentially, I think, a transformational moment where we can tell the governments of the world, that we can tell the stakeholders and the constituencies of the world, stop inventing $250,000 studies, right? And instead give that $250,000 to the NGOs, to the communities, to the people that are already building the strong foundation that, private sector consultants come to the table. They don't have to invent that. They can just inject their subject matter expertise where it's necessary and wanted. Right. So again, keeping it simple, although we're talking about a large kind of complex stepwise methods towards better incorporating community in the decision-making here, or better incorporating community into research and understanding in this presentation, the idea of direct investment into problems that need solving should be the guide star. People are different. Everybody thinks differently, right? You'll see the final bullet here, like, what does it take to get people on the same page? Effort, time and effort equal money, by the way. But that's not all. You need to understand the way that people think and the way that people work. I think a lot of us have probably been to, like, an HOA meeting, or a community meeting, or to a charrette, or to some sort of a collaborative exercise where you bring a lot of personalities and a lot of ideas to the table, right? Like, every person has 2 ideas, right? What do you do about that? And the first thing you got to do is to not only listen, but to also understand where people are coming from. And that doesn't only come from putting yourself in other people's shoes. It comes from an understanding about the way that people think and the way that people act. This is just a tool to have in your back pocket. But there's lots of different ways that we can do better. Bullet number 3 jumps out at me, right? Which is make the meetings bilingual, right? Yeah, it's hard, but it's worth it. And then let's get into another kind of let's use this question to, if you have any ideas on best practices like that we maybe missed in the last couple slides, do feel free to put them in the dialogue here. But the thing that rings true to me is it's pretty easy to talk about best practices in concept. You know, it's really it's really easy to work in the ivory tower or to work at NIH and right, to think about informed consent and say like, here's the best way to do informed consent. But in all of your experiences, like what is the real world? What do you find is real world, like building consensus, driving action, bringing people together, getting a more authentic and better understanding of what the reality is, right? I'm going to come back to something someone mentioned earlier, which is trust building, right? Trust building takes years. Right? Like even together as a group, when us 10 get together once a month over the course of the next 9-ish months, right? How do we really connect? Right? How can we really work together? How can we spend our time and make eye contact and create collaborative, aspirational goals? What are your real world experiences in bringing people together? Look at the chat real quick. Availability of resources is a good question. Something that I like to say to my colleagues is there's always money for good ideas. It's not necessarily true immediately. You have to build and foment momentum, right? Where you share ideas with large constituencies, you bring lots of people together. You find that consensus through whiteboarding or through stepwise approaches. And when you're ready and you're organized, there's a real opportunity for you to be well positioned for available resources. Because of the infrastructure Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and all these kind of federal programs that are, you know, buzzworthy right now. Everybody's talking about grants. Everybody's trying to figure out how do we work together to write grants, submit grants. Put my private sector hat on for a second. You don't want to write grants. You want to write grants that win. The only way to write grants that win is to be well prepared. There's no way you're going to be well prepared if you just saw the NOFO for the first time and it's due in 1 month, right? A lot of times what I suggest to my clients is if there is a NOFO, a notice of a funding opportunity, and you see it pop, it might not be a bad idea to apply for it. But there's 2 things you should do. Number 1 thing you should do is sign up so that you know you get the alerts and you know when it's coming, right? So sign up for those alerts, for those notices of funding opportunities, because you think there's good alignment with your aspirations. Number two is spend the year preparing to write the next one, right? Think about what they want. Think about what the funding agency or the grant agency wants, and then spend a year crafting your narrative. And that allows you, so even if you only have 12 meetings for an hour over the course of a year, you have a good objective over the course of the year to be able to say, hey, our work is going to culminate into a request for funding that we think will be well aligned with the agency's mission. Power is something also worth discussing. Again, preparedness and understanding and boots on the ground knowledge can really help you understand where are the decision makers, right? Who has the power to shape change, and how can we work together to align our aspirations and build consensus with those people? It's a sad reality that it's not that the public process is not a wholly democratic process. It's more of a the republic process, where we come together under representatives that are supposed to actively shape change, right? So all of us getting together empowers those public sector actors to shape change, to organize grants, and to align what the aspirations of government are with what the aspirations of community are.